to anticipate and discuss where nature lies in the future, the cultural future that is unfolding in front of all of us. And to background my thoughts on this matter a little bit, I have always had a relationship to nature which I pretty much took for granted, but perhaps it was more intense and somewhat unique than most people's. I grew up in a small town in Colorado. I was very early into being a rock hound and then a butterfly collector. I had no interest in stamps or baseball cards or anything like that. It was always natural objects. And the attraction of tropical butterflies was the exuberant expanse of color, the affirmation of the patterned richness of the universe that seemed to be thrown out like a spark by these things. And eventually I pursued it quite far and was for some time a professional butterfly collector in tropical Indonesia in a pre-Buddhist incarnation. And this search for iridescence thrown off by nature, seen first in the glint of metallic ore crystals, and then in the colorful expanse of butterflies, and then in tropical fish, reached a kind of apotheosis with the discovery of the psychedelic plant hallucinogens, where suddenly the color, the flash, the iridescence was not 2 or 3 dimensional, but it was multidimensional. It was inside one, outside one. It was like the ultimate tropical aquarium, the ultimate butterfly cabinet, the ultimate mineral show. And it led me to travel then and to place the particular experience of nature in the wider context of place. And I traveled in Indonesia, as I mentioned, where because of glaciation and the shallowness of the oceans, evolution has been proceeding at different rates on different islands relative to the depths of the separating channels. So as you go from island to island in Indonesia, it's like stepping into 10 different bedrooms, all by the same interior decorator, but all slightly different. Different because of the context in which the evolution took place. And these times spent, and then of course there were the times in the Amazon, which most of you have heard me lecture on, where the pursuit of psychedelic plants was really in the forefront. But I came to see nature as experienced, meaning as it hits you when you walk around in it and pick at it and carry it with you, that this kind of nature had been read out of the repertoire of images that most people bring to bear on their reality. And consequently, the reality is de-spirited. The spirit resident in nature is not visible when these mechanistic grids are laid over it. Sort of by a kind of anticipatory osmosis, we called our company, which has existed now 10 years or more, Lux Natura. Lux Natura means the light in nature. The Lux Natura is the salvational radiance that can be found in the organic kingdom. It's a term of Paracelsus. And it has slipped from the grip of modern human beings, except in special cases where it is cultivated as a sensitivity, or where it is pursued in the guise of an aspect of the psychedelic experience. So what is nature, and what's so great about it that it should be the center of the mandala? Well, it seems to me that it is psyche in a way that has become occluded by the perverse development of language, so that what we take to be exterior to ourselves and sustained by the laws of physics, which do not arise out of the human mind, is in fact not that at all, but a kind of stratum of expectation that has been laid down by the human journey through time. Now, granted, there are aspects of nature which are not part of the human journey through time, but they are occult from our point of view. They are not expressed, except perhaps through the demonic artifice of an instrumentality. And this has been the course, or the strategy of science, is to use an instrumentality to reveal the mechanics of the occult side of nature. The problem is that this occult side of nature, once explicated, does not yield a satisfying reflection of ourselves. It yields instead a very unflattering reflection of ourselves, if any at all. So, in Hawaii, sitting on the mountainside, you think that you are like Lenin in Germany or something, and you have to politically think it all through so that to whatever degree one's voice is heard, mistakes are not made. Because it seems to me clear that a small miracle is taking place. It is that, and I was saying this to Roy today, it is that our point of view is actually gaining ground. The thing which we least expected to happen, I think, that all this New Age hustle and bustle, though granted that 95% of it is just intellectual noise and efforts that fail, efforts to coin the perfect analogy that fail, nevertheless, there is a residual 5% that appears to have become the cutting edge of the guiding image of this megaculture. So it becomes important then for people who identify themselves with the human potential movement, spiritual development, the rebirth of intuition, all of these things, to make a place in the plan for the role of nature. And different responses have gone on to that. The Gaia response, which claims nature as a stabilizing feminine force, which I'm all for that. I think that's definitely the image that has to emerge, that the recognition of the presence of control mechanisms which are not coercive but which are Taoistic is a way of coming to terms with nature that we have resisted. This is, it's a simple idea. It's just the idea that before technology, people had to store firewood in the autumn for the winter, and in the spring they had to sharpen tools for the late spring planting and this sort of thing. That there was an implicit rhythm laid down by nature that entered the human cosmos at every level and then was reflected in the poetry, the culture building, the language evolution, etc. And that when urbanization, other factors removed the influence of these rhythms, ending in the final culmination of the modern city where life under electric light goes on 24 hours a day, there's then a flattening of the human dimension. There is no more a sense of being embedded in flux. There is instead the myth of the eternal culture. It's like Woody Allen, his comment that he didn't like to go to the country because you see all these screen doors with cobwebs in the corner. Well, you got to come to terms with this kind of thing. Because there is no question that there is a deepening ambiguity in the present moment. There is a something stealing over global civilization. I was at a conference recently where someone proposed the notion that our time is not special, that there is nothing unique about this moment other than that it is presently occurring. I think nothing could be further from the truth, that actually the deepening ambiguity of the historical experience, which registers in all of us as a sense of how weird it is, how compressed time is, how complicated the interconnections are, is a real phenomenon which eventually will be elucidated. In other words, it will be recognized as a phenomenon. Eventually, there is going to be a break with the prevailing paradigm of historical process. In case you're not aware of it, the prevailing paradigm of historical process is the one which calls itself the trendlessly fluctuating theory. And it says, we trendlessly fluctuate. And to search for a trend is to just be drawn into a kind of cultural hysteria. The fact of the matter is that standing outside the cultural hysteria, the trend is fairly clear. It is a trend toward temporal compression and the emergence of ambiguity. How is it possible? You look at something like Common Ground or even the Shared Visions newsletter, and you say, apparently the major commodity moving on world markets is ambiguity. The voices which whisper to us from crystals, herbs, and housewives, the invisible fields from all dimensions which impinge upon us, the imagined histories and futures which intersect the present moment. I mean, if all of these models, or even a small portion of them, are given credence, then the density of the human experience is considerably deepened. I mean, how many past lives can you keep track of? How many extraterrestrial channels can you have open before you begin to realize that, you're not living in the kind of society like Mom and Dad were used to? So, back to the theme of nature. Nature anticipates all of this and anchors this. Nature is actually the goal at the end of history. We're getting closer and closer to the end of history, and we will not go past it with a moment of blindness. There will be vouchsafed intuitions about the emerging structure of the other into which culture is being subsumed. You're all familiar with the image of the Ouroboros, the snake which takes its tail in its mouth. Well, the end of history, which you've heard me talk about as an archaic revival, that's true, an archaic revival, but the ground of being in which the original archaic Renaissance occurred was nature. So in terms of the expression of design elements, in terms of the expression of human relationships, political agendas, all of these things, the economies of nature are going to set the guiding images. It's very interesting. I read Stephen Jay Gould's book, Biophilia, in which he describes his work with ants in Suriname. and how there are ants which grow fungi in their nests. They cut leaves off trees and chew them up into this mash, which they then store in rooms underground, and they bring the right spores to it and grow it there, and it produces a sugar which the ants then eat. And they tend the fungal gardens. They actually remove foreign spores and this sort of thing, and the whole symbiosis goes on. Well, it's a symbiosis between a social organism, the ant, and a fungal organism which is able to provide an enzyme, sugar, which drives the ant society to a greater state of activity. Activity being the bottom line in an insect economy, where how much you can get done determines how well you survive, provided the triodes of getting done are well established. Well, this provides a curious analogy to the situation that exists in human societies vis-a-vis hallucinogenic plants. Hallucinogenic plants act as enzymes which stimulate imagination. And imagination, having a practical side to itself, is usually reconnected to this process in a feedback loop that asks the question, how can we make more of the hallucinogenic plant which is giving us all these great ideas? So then you get initially the invention of agriculture. But one can't grow all plants in one place, as we learned even about Hawaii. So then the feedback loop in the imagination, driven by the presence of the hallucinogen in the diet, asks the question, how can we get the plants that we can't grow? And the answer is networks of trade and systems of barter. And behind that lies the need for language, similar sorts of things. These kinds of symbiotic processes are implicit in the human experience. Some of you have heard another lecture I give which goes into this in great detail, where I actually try to show that the presence of mushrooms in the dung of ungulate animals on the veldt of Africa 150,000 years ago drove a set of processes which resulted in self-reflecting human beings. I won't recapitulate that now, except to say that that process didn't end with the invention of language or the domestication of cattle. It continues right up until the present day. It really is as though, from a planetary point of view, what has happened is an enzyme system called the human species was deputized into an information gathering mode, sent out as a kind of prodigal subsystem, a kind of episome of the social environment, to cognize the organization of the natural world through a process called human history, or the historical advance of understanding toward sufficiently complete modeling of the ground that closure could occur. And that is now, I think, what is happening, that the human species, which was deputized for Gaia, into the fall into profane time, the time of non-participation in the immediacy of the Tao, through a series of successive linguistic declensions. That's what it was. I mean, this begins to sound almost biblical, because what we're saying is there's a fall, and the fall is somehow related to a confusion of languages, not one from another, but from the object of experience. And as the language became less and less natural, the world of the species using this language became less and less natural, because the evolution of symbols moved toward the abstract, became the realization of ideals. Notice that as early as Platonic philosophy, and I'm not sure, well, no, even in pre-Socratic philosophy, you get the enunciation of abstractions, great overweening concepts which subsume large sets of particulars underneath them. And this ability to subsume the particulars under a name, which is a class name, is the beginning of this process of replacing the natural language with the symbolic structures that then interfere between soul and nature. The reason for this process we can really only guess at. It seems as though nature requires this reflection upon itself, that the completion of nature is somehow in the hands of a single target species, which acts as an enzyme within the global organism of Gaia. From the point of view of an extraterrestrial looking down on the surface of the planet, there are not discrete organisms. There is simply a gene swarm, and through transmission of viruses and numerous non-genetic ways in which genes are transformed, the previously imagined sharp declensions between species are actually somewhat illusory. So that really, within the confines of my body, the unfolding of gene expression and the molecular assembly of enzyme systems and proteins and that sort of thing is simply under a tighter regimen of control than are the same kind of processes which are going on between people. We are really a loosely regulated organism that has a tendency to ever tighten the control between its subunits, so that you can see the evolution of language, the evolution of technology, and its being at the service of media, the rise of cities, oral poetry. All of these things, we seem to strive for greater and greater cohesion, greater and greater free flow of thought among ourselves. And what we're looking toward is a moment when the artificial language structures which bind us within the notion of ourselves are dissolved in the presence of the realization that we are a part of nature. And when that happens, the childhood of our species will pass away, and we will stand tremulously on the brink of really the first moments of coherent human civilization. And when that happens, the noise which haunts our social systems, our inability to couple things together so that they work, will begin to evaporate. This, I think, is already beginning to happen. It's a slow process, but it's a kind of cascading phenomenon such that once it begins to happen, it happens faster and faster. And the mirroring of psyche that was always the glamour, if you will, which stood behind nature, is correctly perceived with greater and greater clarity as this process proceeds. And this correct perceiving of nature's relationship to self and language is the essence of all of these cultural vectors that are converging. Feminism, the exploration of space, the perfection of the thinking machine, or of the human-machine interface, the mysterium tremendum at the core of the psychedelic experience. All of these things are, I think, going to be seen as anticipations of this post-historical state, which lies beyond the working out of the themes that have been set in motion by materialistic science. In other words, the forces that are being set in motion and sustained by so-called new thought, new age thinking. This is why, because this seems to be happening, because it seems that we, and by we I mean all of us, did in fact identify early on a trend in society which is now going to have enormous repercussions, that there is a responsibility to clear thinking about what this thing is and how it works. There seems to be a kind of a rush to get in line with the sloppiest metaphor as quickly as possible, so that, and there have been a number of, let's say, syncretic faiths or new myths that have arisen and competed with each other with greater and lesser degrees of success. I suppose this is a healthy thing, except that it gives such comfort to the people who think we're all airheads. They observe all this, and it confirms for them that it's a hopeless lot. Nevertheless, So I guess what I want to say about that is that everybody has their own version of what is the mistake which is being made, right? So here's my version of what is the mistake that's being made. It's that there is a confusion between scientific materialism and reason. Science has set itself up as a kind of new pontificate, and brooks no challenge. It expects to make judgment on any idea emerging from any realm of human endeavor. It has set itself up as judge and jury. The fact of the matter is that this is only by virtue of its spectacular acts of technological prestidigitation that it's able to presume to do this. Because really what science is most successful about in telling us about are realms which none of us have ever penetrated nor are ever likely to. How much do you wish to know about the rings of Neptune or the quark? We're continuously sold the line that somehow when the metaphors of consciousness are fully mapped onto quantum physics and biology, that a great step forward will have been taken. It seems to me that since the information coming out of quantum physics and molecular biology is so removed from the realm of common experience, that if we succeed in mapping mental phenomena onto those realms, we will have succeeded in the final act of alienation, because we will have at last totally removed our experience of ourselves from the realm of felt cognition. So I think that instead of the idea that there needs to be a kind of erection of an overarching metaphor from the physical sciences into the social and psychiatric sciences, instead there should be the recognition and celebration of mystery, that in fact we are an intelligent species caught in a historical process. No generation which preceded us knew what was going on. And there is no reason to assume that we know what's going on or that the generation which follows us will know what's going on. And what kind of trip is it, anyway, to insist on knowing what's going on? It's a highly unlikely enterprise. I mean, look at the data sample. The data sample is your lifetime on one planet in one tiny corner of the universe. And from this, via the fallacy of induction, certain principles of uniformity are extended to the far-flung corners of the cosmos in space and time. Then a bunch of fancy metaphors are built up that nobody can check on anyway. And then this is called understanding. You see, it isn't understanding. Understanding issues into appropriate activity. And, a model of the universe which doesn't issue into appropriate activity in the here and now is a curious model indeed. After all, appropriate activity in the here and now, I would think, would be the sine qua non. Everything else is unconfirmed rumor. So, nature is the visible manifestation of this mystery. It entirely surrounds and completes us. It is there to be beheld and imbibed in. It is simply that one must either replace the sterile language of scientific materialism, or one must bring no language whatsoever to it, so that it speaks for itself. I've noticed with ayahuasca, this South American visionary vine that's a hallucinogen, unlike the mushroom, it does not speak. It shows. Its language is visible, a fractal hieroglyphic surface of intermediate dimensions that contains an endless unfolding of phenomena at level after level, apparently, who knows, down into the microphysical realm. This is a correct seeing of what is. The mystery is co-present with its denial. It is a matter of changing points of view. And changing points of view is a matter of retooling language. If nature is psyche, then so is the autopoetic, self-reflecting cloud of cognition that manifests as language. It is partly based in the structure of matter. It is partly based in the implicit syntax of the perceiver. It is partly an interference pattern between the two. But it is as close to the ground that one can approach without theory.